In the third cycle of the long survey, a Vethic registrar named myself opened a death file for a species that had only just learned to leave its own star. The procedure was routine. We of the Vethic do not hunt, we do not conquer, we do not grieve. We record. For 19 million years our colonies have anchored ourselves to the cold rock of dead moons and watched the galaxy fill with life and then empty of it again, and we have written down the names of the ones who failed. We are very good at our work. We are patient and we are thorough, and we are almost never wrong. I want you to remember that I said almost. The species was called human. Their world of origin does not matter to this account. What matters is the small, ugly colony they founded at the far edge of charted space, on the fourth planet of a dim and miserable star, a place they named Hollow Reach. It was a terrible world. The atmosphere was a soup of corrosive haze. The seas were the color of bruises. Lightning storms the size of continents walked across the surface for years at a time without stopping. Nothing about Hollow Reach invited settlement, and the humans who went there did so because nowhere better would have them. They were debtors, exiles, the overflow of a crowded frontier. They arrived with patched ships and second-hand tools and a stubbornness that we, at the time, mistook for stupidity. For a generation, Hollow Reach was nothing. A few domes, a failing mine, mosquitoes, if you will forgive the human word, everywhere. And then a survey crew mapping the dead space beyond the colony discovered the one thing that would change everything. The corridor. You have to understand what a transit corridor is to understand what happened next. The galaxy is not an open sea. The space between the stars is folded and knotted, and only in a few rare places does it lie smooth enough for a ship to cross safely at speed. These smooth places are the corridors, and they are everything. They are the roads. They are the rivers. Empires are built on them and die without them. And the survey crew of Hollow Reach discovered that their miserable star sat astride the only stable corridor linking the Perseus Marches to the entire Sagittarian interior. Every ship, every cargo, every fleet that wished to pass between two enormous arms of the galaxy would, from now until the heat death of everything, have to pass within reach of Hollow Reach's guns. Overnight, the dead end became the crossroads of known space. I filed this development carefully. A poor, defenseless human colony, no fleet to speak of, no allies, sitting alone on top of the single most valuable piece of real estate in the local galaxy. I did not need to be a strategist to see how this story would end. I wrote the opening line of their death file that very cycle. Cause of extinction. Pending, but inevitable. I was so confident of this that I allocated only a modest amount of storage to the entry. I assumed it would be brief. It is, at present, the longest single entry in the entire Vethic registry. It has its own subsidiary archive. It has footnotes that have footnotes. Generations of my colony have been born, calcified, and died maintaining it, and it is not finished, and I have come to suspect it never will be. But I am getting ahead of myself. A good archivist tells the story in order, and the order begins not with humanity, but with the thing that came to eat them. That thing was called the sovereignty. The sovereignty was not one species but a coalition of them, bound together by a single shared conviction, that the strong were entitled to whatever the weak could not hold. They were apex predators, all of them, evolved on a dozen separate worlds to chase and corner and kill, and when they reached the stars they simply scaled their instincts up to the size of empires. The sovereignty did not negotiate. It assessed. It looked at a thing, measured what it would cost to take, and if the cost was acceptable, it took. And in the cycle that the corridor was discovered, the sovereignty was hungry. It was expanding faster than its supply lines could bear, and it was desperate for choke points, for exactly the kind of road that Hollow Reach now sat upon. A poor colony, a priceless road, a starving empire. You do not need me to tell you what comes next, because some stories are older than any species that tells them. The first to come was an opportunist. His name was Vorsethek, a minor sovereignty commander of no particular distinction, the sort of officer who is given a single old warship, and told to make his own fortune at the edges of the map. He learned of Hollow Reach the way jackals learn of a wounded animal, by rumor, and he arrived during a supply blackout, when the colony's long-range sensors were down for maintenance, and its handful of armed shuttles sat grounded for want of fuel. Vorsethek did not have to fight. He simply parked his warship in orbit, opened a channel, and explained, very calmly, what his weapons would do to the habitat domes if the colony did not begin paying a transit toll on every ship that used the corridor. The colony paid. What else could it do? Vorsethek left rich, having fired not a single shot, and the playbook of Hollow Reach was written in that moment, as clean and simple as any equation. Arrive, threat, collect, leave. I recorded the event and amended the death file. I noted with what I can only now describe as embarrassing certainty that the humans had demonstrated their fundamental nature. They would rather pay than die. I countersigned the certificate provisionally. I considered the matter all but closed. The second to come was no opportunist. She was a sovereignty warlord of real standing, commanding a full battle group, and she did not want tolls. She wanted the corridor itself, and she arrived expecting the same easy surrender Vorsethek had enjoyed. But the humans of Hollow Reach had spent the intervening years doing something I had not bothered to predict. They had been getting angry. When the warlord's battle group entered the system, the colony fought. Not well, they had almost nothing to fight with, a few converted mining vessels, some hastily armed freighters, a planetary defense grid cobbled together from salvage. They lost. Of course they lost. But they made the warlord bleed for it, dragging the engagement out across 40 days, turning every approach into a knife fight in the storm shadow of the planet. And when she finally seized the orbital high ground and extorted her ransom, she left with fewer ships than she had brought and a profound dislike of the place. Word of this spread through the Sovereignty's officer corps, and Hollow Reach acquired its first real reputation. Rich, yes, and weak, yes, but mean. A soft target, that bit. The kind of prize that made a career, and occasionally ended one. I amended the death file again. I confess the amendments were beginning to annoy me. And then came the one whose name still echoes through this account, the conqueror who turned Hollow Reach from a frontier nuisance into a legend. His name was Kael'ton Moore, and to understand why what he did mattered, you must understand who he was. Kael'ton Moore was the most celebrated soldier the Sovereignty had ever produced. He had broken 9 civilizations. He had taken fortified worlds that the Sovereignty's own war colleges taught were impregnable. He was not interested in tolls or ransoms or careers. He was interested in his own name, and his name needed jewels and Hollow Reach, the priceless crossroads that 2 officers before him had failed to truly hold, was the brightest jewel left unclaimed in that arm of the galaxy. He came with a fleet, and he came clever. Where the warlord had attacked the planet head-on through the storm shadow and paid for it, Kael'ton Moore studied the corridor approach and found its weakness. There was a narrow lane, a fold in space near the system's outer reaches, where the gravitational geometry forced any defending ship into a single predictable line. The humans had always assumed no attacker would be patient enough to use it. Kael'ton Moore was that patient. He threaded his fleet through the fold one ship at a time, in perfect order, and emerged inside the colony's defenses, behind every gun they had. And from there the outcome was never in doubt. He did not ransom Hollow Reach. He gutted it. He destroyed the orbital grid, burned the outer habitats, shattered the mine, and stripped the colony of everything of value down to the copper in its walls. He occupied the system for a full standard year methodically, the way a careful man empties a house he intends to sell. And when he finally left, Hollow Reach was a ruin, its population halved, its leaders dead or fled, its corridor open to anyone strong enough to want it. The message the surviving colonial governor transmitted to the human frontier afterward is one of the documents I have kept. Across all these cycles, in the most protected layer of the archive, I will not reproduce it because it is theirs and not mine to give away. But I will tell you its substance. The governor wrote that she did not know how to begin to describe what had been lost. She wrote that the colony could not be rebuilt as it had been. And then, in the last lines, she wrote something that I did not understand at the time and have spent 19 cycles understanding since. She wrote that Hollow Reach would not survive by becoming stronger. It would survive by becoming uneatable. I did not know what that meant. I filed the death file as nearing completion. I was, by every measure available to me, correct. This is the part of the story where I must admit that I began to be wrong. And to explain how, I have to tell you about the woman who taught a planet to defend itself by giving up the idea of winning. Her name was Isolde Marchetti, and she was not a soldier. She was an administrator, a logistician, the kind of person who in better times would have spent her life arguing about water rights and shuttle schedules. When Cailton Moore's fleet finally departed, she was simply the most senior official left alive, and so the broken colony became hers to either bury or save. She chose, against all reason, to save it. But she had no fleet to build, no army to raise, no allies to call. What she had was the one thing every other power in the galaxy had spent the entire history of Hollow Reach trying to get rid of: the planet itself, the poison air, the bruised seas, the endless walking storms. What Isolde Marchetti understood, and what I, in my certainty, had entirely failed to consider, was that Hollow Reach was not a weak world. It was a lethal one. For 3 generations the humans had survived there by fighting the planet, sealing themselves away from it, treating its hostility as an enemy to be endured. Marchetti proposed the opposite. She proposed that they stop fighting the death world and start living inside it, the way a thorn bush lives inside its own thorns. She would not build a fortress of steel that an enemy could breach. She would make the entire system into the kind of place where an enemy simply could not survive long enough to win. It took her the rest of her life. They seeded the upper atmosphere with engineered organisms that thrived in the corrosive haze and fed on the alloys of foreign hulls. They mapped the great storms and built their new settlements not in spite of them, but inside them, in the calm cores of the walking giants, so that any attacking fleet would have to chase a city through a wall of lightning that would never stop moving. They burrowed deep into the planet's crust, into networks so vast and so dark that an invader could spend a year searching and never find the bottom. And above all, they changed their doctrine. They stopped asking how to win a battle. They started asking a single, patient, devastating question, and they asked it of every plan and every weapon and every wall they built. How long can we make this take? The Vethic have a word for what Hollow Reach became, and there is no clean translation, but it means something like a wound that closes around the blade. I watched it happen across the years, and I recorded it, and I want to tell you that I understood what I was seeing. I did not. None of us did. And neither, fatally, did the sovereignty. Because here is the detail on which the entire story turns, the hinge of the whole account, and I want you to hold on to it as we move toward the end. When Cailton Moore gutted Hollow Reach, the Sovereignty's War College formally reclassified the system. They labeled it a death world, not as praise but as a dismissal, a bureaucratic notation meaning not worth the cost of holding, lethal to occupy, of no further strategic interest. And because they had classified it so, they stopped studying it. They stopped sending scouts. They stopped updating their charts. In the Great Sovereignty Registry, beside the entry for Hollow Reach, an officer stamped a single word that meant finished, and then everyone who mattered looked away. They never saw the fortress grow. They were certain there was nothing left to see. The first true test of Marchetti's living fortress came not from a conqueror but from a scavenger, a sovereignty raider captain who had heard the old stories of the rich colony and had not heard, or had not believed, that it was now a graveyard. He came expecting ruins and easy salvage. He found a system that ate him. His ships entered the haze, and within days their hulls began to corrode from the engineered organisms feeding on his alloys. He pursued a human settlement into the core of a storm, and the storm swallowed his fleet whole, scattering his ships across 1,000 kilometers of lightning. Those who landed and went searching for the burrowed cities never came back up. The dark down there was very deep, and the humans knew it and he did not. His final transmission, broadcast in the clear before his command ship failed, has become something of a proverb among my colony. He did not curse the humans. He cursed the planet. He said, in effect, that he had come to rob a corpse and the corpse had teeth. Then his signal stopped. The sovereignty, having classified the system as finished, did not even register his loss as a defeat. They logged it as an accident. A death world, after all, kills people. That is what it is for. The second test was cleverer, and it nearly succeeded. A sovereignty commander who had actually read the old reports came not to occupy Hollow Reach but to crack it open, and he came with a turncoat, a human exile, one of the old debtors who had fled when Kael'ton Moore came and who now sold his knowledge of the burrows and the storm cores to the enemy for a promised fortune. With the traitor's guidance, the commander's forces got deeper into the living fortress than anyone before them, reaching the threshold of one of the great underground cities before the defense closed around them. It was Marchetti's successor. She had died by then, an old woman in a calm room in the heart of a storm, who refined the doctrine one final time in response. They sealed the betrayed routes and rigged them, not with explosives, but with the planet itself, opening the burrows to the corrosive haze so that the invaders' own deep penetration became the channel of their drowning. The commander withdrew with a fraction of his force. The traitor was not among the survivors, and I have never been able to determine which side that fact should be credited to. After that, the stories changed. They no longer spread among the sovereignty as tales of a rich prize. They spread as warnings. Hollow Reach became the place you did not go, the graveyard system, the death world that was somehow, impossibly, inhabited, though by what exactly the sovereignty's officers could no longer say, because their charts still read finished, and no one with the authority to update them believed there was anything left alive to chart. And so we come to the end, and to the largest force this account will ever describe, and to the two beings who stood on opposite sides of it. Before I tell you how it ended, I must do the thing the humans themselves taught me to do, which is to pause and address you directly, you who are listening to this record across whatever gulf of time separates us. Everything I have told you so far, I told you as the sovereignty understood it, and as I once understood it, a weak species, a valuable road, an inevitable death. I told you that humanity would rather pay than die. I told you their world would be their grave. I countersigned their extinction certificate 3 separate times. Hold all of that in your mind now, because the sovereignty held it too with absolute and total certainty, right up until the moment it destroyed them. The sovereignty's leadership, weary of the corridor remaining beyond their grasp, made a decision. They would not raid Hollow Reach. They would not occupy it. They would erase it, render the system sterile, scour the planet, remove the inconvenient death world from the map entirely so that the corridor could be held by an orbital fortress of their own building, free of whatever it was that kept killing their captains. And to do this, they assembled the largest armada the sovereignty had ever fielded. The numbers in my records are difficult to credit even now. Over 4,000 vessels, more than 2 million personnel, war engines that could crack a planet's crust, sterilization ordnance enough to boil the bruised seas to vapor. It was not a fleet. It was a verdict, given physical form and sent across the stars to be carried out. They placed it under the command of Grand Admiral Sethric Valancourt, the most senior soldier in the sovereignty, a being whose confidence was so total that he committed the single act that, more than any other, tells you how this story ends. Before the Armada had so much as departed, while the corridor was still a thing to be conquered rather than a thing conquered, Sethric Valancourt commissioned his victory monument. He had it carved from the heartstone of his homeworld, a vast sculpture of himself standing in triumph over a kneeling, defeated humanity, the death world burning behind him, the corridor open at his feet. He had it shipped ahead, to be installed at the corridor's mouth the moment the work was done. He had, in the most literal sense, declared his victory before the first shot was fired. And the Sovereignty Registry, that great cold ledger of the strong, recorded the campaign's success in advance and stamped the human entry, for the final time, closed. I want to be precise about what that meant, because it is the entire point of this account. The sovereignty did not merely expect to win. They had stopped considering humanity at all. In their records, in their plans, in their minds, humanity was already dead. They were not sailing out to fight an enemy. They were sailing out to dispose of a body. And a being who believes he is disposing of a body does not check whether it is breathing. Against the Armada, against 2 million predators and 4,000 ships, and a verdict carved in stone, Hollow Reach sent one defender to the corridor's mouth. His name was Tobias Wren, and if I had been asked to design the least plausible savior for a species, I could not have done better. He was old. He had fought in the long border wars of the human frontier, and the wars had used him hard. He had lost a leg to a hull breach decades before, and the synthetic that replaced it never worked quite right, so that he walked with a lurch the whole colony knew by sound. He had lost most of the hearing in one ear and most of the vision in one eye to the same incident. His left hand had been crushed and rebuilt and never regained its strength. He was, by the unkind arithmetic of war, a fraction of a soldier. The younger officers of Hollow Reach called him, not entirely without affection, the Wreck. And Tobias Wren, who had heard the name and decided to keep it, used to say that a body could lose a great many parts and still hold a position, so long as the part it kept was the one that refused to move. This was the being humanity put in the path of the largest armada in sovereignty history. He had perhaps 200 ships, most of them old, many of them barely armed. He was outnumbered something on the order of 20 to 1. And he understood, with the cold clarity that Usold Marchetti had bequeathed to her world like an heirloom, exactly one true thing about his situation, which was that he could not win. So he did not try to. When the Armada arrived and beheld Hollow Reach for the first time, its officers saw what their century-old charts had told them they would see. A dim star, a poisoned planet, a death world ripe for sterilization. They did not see a fortress, because the fortress was not made of the things they had been trained to recognize. It was made of haze and storm and patience and the dark under the ground, and of one old man with a bad leg who had decided not to move. Sethric Valancourt surveyed the system from his flagship, found it exactly as worthless as he had been promised, and gave the order to begin. What followed took 211 days, and I will not pretend to narrate every hour of it, because the truth of the thing is not in the violence. It is in the slowness. Tobias Wren fought the way a man closes a door against a flood, not stopping the water but buying the room behind him another moment, and another, and another. He did not meet the Armada in open battle. He bled it. He drew its vanguard into the gravitational fold near the system's edge. The same fold Caelton Moore had once used to defeat the colony, now turned inside out, and forced the great fleet to thread itself through one ship at a time, into the waiting haze. He retreated his cities through the storm cores, and made the Armada chase them through walls of lightning that scattered formations and shorted weapons and drove crews mad with the noise. He opened the burrows and let the Armada's landing forces descend into a darkness from which they did not climb back out. And all the while, doing the patient work that no weapon of the sovereignty was built to fight, the Death World did what Death Worlds do. The engineered organisms found the Armada's hulls and began, slowly, to eat them. The corrosive air found seals and worked them loose. And then the thing that Marchetti had counted on from the very beginning, the invisible ally that had been waiting in the bruised seas and the poison haze for 100 years, arrived in full. Sickness. The biosphere of Hollow Reach was not merely hostile to machines. It was hostile to flesh, in 10,000 subtle ways the sovereignty had never studied because they had classified the system as finished and stopped looking. Their crews, sealed in failing hulls, breathing recycled air gone slowly foul, began to die. Not in the battle, between the battles. In the long, slow, grinding days of a siege that would not resolve, against an enemy who would not stand still and could not be brought to a decisive fight, on the edge of a planet that was killing them by inches, in ways their instruments could not even name. And the command of that armada, the apex predators who had carved their victory in stone before they sailed, did the last thing a doomed force always does. They turned on each other. Sethric Valancourt blamed his fleet officers blamed his ground commanders. The great unified verdict that had set out from the sovereignty's heart fractured into a dozen quarreling pieces, each certain the others had failed it. They had planned for a corpse. They had not planned for a war, and they had least of all planned for a war they were losing to nothing they could see. On the 211th day, with more than two-thirds of his ships destroyed or abandoned for want of living crews to fly them, Grand Admiral Sethric Valancourt ordered the armada to withdraw. But the Death World does not grant clean exits. The retreat was worse than the siege. Ships failed in the fold and were lost. Crews already sick died in the long crossing home. Of the 4,000 vessels that set out to dispose of a body, fewer than 900 ever saw sovereignty space again, and of the 2 million who sailed, the figure I have recorded for the survivors is one I rechecked many times before I would commit it to the archive, because it shamed the arithmetic of empire so completely. It was not a defeat, it was an unmaking. Hollow Reach lost a great deal. Settlements burned. Storm cores went dark. Many thousands of humans died in the 211 days, and Tobias Wren lost all but a handful of his old ships. But the corridor held. The fortress of haze and patience held. And the verdict carved in Hearthstone, the monument of triumph that Sethric Valancourt had shipped ahead so confidently, was found drifting in the wreckage of his vanguard when the humans went out to survey what the Death World had left them. They did not destroy it. According to the records I have been able to confirm, they towed it intact to the mouth of the corridor and installed it exactly where the Grand Admiral had intended, facing outward, toward the sovereignty, a sculpture of a predator standing in triumph over a kneeling humanity, mounted by humanity itself as a road marker for every ship that would ever pass that way again. It is, I am told, still there. The political consequences of the unmaking reshaped the galaxy more thoroughly than any single battle in the record. The sovereignty had spent the lives of 2 million of its strongest, and the better part of its war fleet on a body it had been certain was already cold. And when the survivors limped home with the truth, the coalition of predator species that had held together for 1,000 years on the simple conviction that the strong always win discovered that it no longer believed its own founding principle. The sovereignty did not fall in a day, but it never expanded again. The chokepoint it had starved for stayed in human hands, and the powers it had bullied for a millennium took note of the Death World that had eaten an armada, and within a few generations the coalition fractured along 100 old seams and became, in time, simply one more entry in my archive. I keep its death file beside humanity's. The sovereignty's is, I will note, considerably shorter. Tobias Wren did not live long enough to see the empire he had broken finish breaking. The 211 days had asked more of his ruined body than it had left to give, and the sicknesses of the Death World, which spared no flesh, took him as surely as they had taken the Armada's crews, only slower. He died in a calm room in the core of a storm, in the city Usold Marchetti's successors had built, and the records suggest he died without much ceremony, because the colony was still burying its dead and rebuilding its walls, and did not yet understand the scale of what the wreck with the bad leg had done for them. His own people did not honor him properly for 2 full generations. When they finally did, it was with a statue at the mouth of the corridor, near the Grand Admiral's stolen monument, an old man, leaning on a bad leg, looking outward at the road he refused to let anyone take. Half a soldier, the inscription says, who held a whole position. The humans, it turns out, have always understood the particular dignity of the thing that simply will not move. And so I come to the end of the account, and to the confession that is its real purpose. You will remember that I opened a death file for humanity in the 3rd cycle of the long survey, certain it would be brief. You will remember that I countersigned their extinction 3 separate times. You will remember that the entire sovereignty, that vast and ancient machine for measuring the strong against the weak, classified Hollow Reach as finished and stopped watching it, and that this single act of certainty, not a weapon, not a flaw in the walls, but the simple decision to stop looking, was the wound through which an empire bled to death. The Vethic made the same mistake. I want that on the record in my own words because an archivist who hides her errors is no archivist at all. We are very good at our work. We are patient and we are thorough. And we wrote a species off as dead because we could not imagine that the strong is not always the one with the most ships, that a fortress can be made of weather and time, that a body losing parts can hold a position, that a world meant to be a grave can be made into a thorn bush that closes around the blade. We measured humanity by what it could destroy, and we never thought to measure what it could outlast. You can stand at the mouth of the corridor today if you ever travel that road. The ships still pass through, more of them every year, every flag in the local galaxy among them, all paying their courtesies to the humans of Hollow Reach who hold the only door between two arms of the sky. The poison air still hangs over the bruised seas. The great storms still walk. And two statues still stand facing outward, a conqueror's monument that conquered nothing, and an old man who never moved, so close together that from a passing ship, I am told, they appear almost to be in conversation. It is hard to believe, watching that quiet and thriving world go about its business, that it was once the most contested point in the galaxy, marked for extinction by the strongest power that ever lived. As for the death file, I keep it open. I am required to, by the laws of my own archive, until a species is verifiably gone, and humanity is, by every measure I possess, embarrassingly alive. The entry has grown beyond all proportion. It has its own subsidiary archive. It has footnotes upon footnotes, each one a moment when the galaxy was certain humanity had finally reached its end and was, once again, wrong. I have amended it more times than any entry in 19 million years of Vethic record-keeping. My successors will amend it after me. It is the longest, most studied, most corrected entry we have ever maintained, a monument to certainty undone, and I have come to believe it will never close. We of the Vethic record the deaths of civilizations. It is what we are for. And in all that long and careful work across all those cycles, the one entry we cannot finish, the one verdict we keep being forced to take back, is the one we were most certain of on the day we began. I have stopped being certain about humanity. I recommend to anyone who would conquer them that you do the same. To declare a thing finished is to stop watching it. And the humans, I have learned, do their best work in exactly the moment that everyone has agreed to look away.